tell, then you see the road. I'm out to my soul into the size. Whenever the smoke clear out of my face and my picture perfect, you do it.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the second part of, What If Harry Potter Meets Monster Girl Encyclopedia. Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of Asian Lion Heart 310 on fanfiction.net. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. The air was turning cooler as the sun slowly started to decline in the sky. Jaya sighed as she stepped out of the woods, carrying in her arms the familiar tiny form of Harry James Potter. The Jinko then sighed as she saw the rocky pass that lead to their destination but took a deep breath before going forward. The little boy in her arms was looking around with childish curiosity but also some tiredness while the one holding him glanced at him from time to time. Many hours had passed since his encounter with Esther the succubus and things had been interesting to say the least. Jaya shivered as she retailed what had happened after Esther pulled out the strange misty thing from Harry's scar. Flashback. Esther. What was that? Lana asked the succubus with narrowed eyes. Jaya did the same while comforting the crying boy in her arms. The succubus slowly turned her gaze toward them before sighing deeply. Well, where should I start? Maybe you could start with what you saw in Harry's memory, the Jinko replied calmly but with a stern look in her eyes. Clearly, she was a bit upset at seeing Harry crying his little heart out. All right, but we warned it is not good at all, Esther told them with a serious expression as she glanced back and forth between the Lamia and the Jinko. The two glanced at one another then at Harry who had stopped crying and instead with sniffing before looking back at the succubus with a serious expression on their faces. Esther waited for a few seconds before nodding her head with a sigh. Very well, first of all, yes, Harry here is a wizard as were his parents. Really? Harry's shocked question interrupted her. Yes, child, your father, James Fleamont Potter, was apparently the lord of an ancient and noble house and your mother, Lily Evans Potter, was the brightest witch of her age, Esther answered him with a smile. So that mean they weren't drunkards? Harry asked her with a surprised but hopeful expression on his face. Lana and Jaya growled a bit at those words but couldn't voice their thoughts as Esther answered him gently. No, child, from what I saw, your parents were honorable people who gave their lives to protect you. What do you mean? Harry asked her with confusion clear on his face. Harry, they died to protect you from someone who wanted your death. Esther's answer was not what they expected. Lana and Jaya looks between their friend and Harry with shock and horror, unsure of what to say. But the most shocked one in the group was none other than the boy himself. His emerald eyes showed nothing but shock and surprise as he stared at the succubus with disbelief. But I was told that they died in a car crash. They did not, child, they were murdered by a dark lord who wanted to kill you. Me? Harry asked her with shock while pointing at himself with a finger. What? Why? Lana blurted out in equal shock as, at her side, Jaya's eyes narrowed dangerously. Because of a prophecy apparently, Esther answered the Lamia with a scoff. A prophecy? Jaya asked her with a deadpan expression on her face. Yes, here is the exact wording. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the seventh month dies and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not and either must die at the hand of the other for neither can live while the other survives. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord will be born as the seventh month dies. The little group stayed silent as their minds processed what they just heard. Harry didn't understand what it meant, but it did sound intriguing. Jaya and Lana were looking either at the ground or at the little one while Esther was looking at everyone, letting them processing her words. That's rubbish, the Jinko muttered after a moment of silence. I agree, but this Dark Lord, whose name was apparently Voldemort, snorts could be heard at that funny name I know, but back to topic, this Dark Lord took the prophecy seriously and tried to prevent it by killing young Harry here, Esther explained in a calm tone, but her eyes showed how much she wanted to sneer. That's stupid. Lana growled in anger as her tail tip shook a bit like a rattlesnake's. Her arms were crossed under her bust and her eyes showed nothing but disgust. Again I agree, but there is more, Esther said with a sigh before telling them about what happened after the death of Harry's parents. She explained to them how Harry's godfather, a new shock for the boy who didn't even know he had won, had gone to avenge his friends while leaving his godson in Hagrid's care. Lana and Jaya were intrigued by Hagrid's description but didn't voice what they were thinking as they listened patiently to Esther's observations. When the succubus reached the part about Dumbledore's words, she paused. Esther was conflicted about telling it in front of Harry and shot a pleading look toward her friends, hoping they would understand. Jaya, seeing her expression, frowned before looking down at her charge in hesitation. In her mind, it was only fair for Harry to hear what the succubus had seen because it concerned him, but if Esther stopped like that, then that must mean that it must be far too terrible to say. Harry? Can you go back to the room, please? But I want to stay, Miss Jaya. I want to know why I was left with Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia, Harry answered her in a soft tone. I understand, but are you sure? What you might hear will probably scare you, the Jinko asked him kindly, rocking him in her arms. Harry looked hesitant at first, but then he looked up at her with a face showing nothing but determination. Or at least tried, as instead, he looked like he was pleading her to allow him to stay. Lana cooed in surprise at the sight while Esther smirked in amusement as she crossed her arms, staring at both Harry and Jaya. What of the Jinko? She was frozen in place as her fiery orange eyes were locking on Harry's face. He looked so cute right now, her heart melted at the sight of his shining emerald green eyes, looking at her like a puppy wanting to receive hugs. Very well, you may stay, Jaya answered after a few seconds of silence, and her reward was a bright smile on the little one's face. Then she shot her friends a glare, threatening them to say anything about this, but only received amused giggles from the two, much to her chagrin. Esther was still a bit hesitant at resuming her story, with Harry still present, but seeing that the boy wanted to hear it, she had no choice in the matter. You remind me of my daughter, little one. Perhaps one day, you will meet you, the succubus said to Harry with a tiny grin as she patted the top of his head. I would love to, Miss Esther, he responded shyly with a hint of pink on his cheek. The three Momonos giggled in amusement at this reaction before Esther's face turned serious again. Once the woman and Hagrid left, Old Man Dumbledore said something to Harry, something that made me want to go find him and skin him alive, the succubus said with a growl and clenched fists. What did he say? Lana asked her curiously but also with dread. Are you sure you want to hear it? Esther asked them hesitantly. Yes, the Lamia and Jinko said at the same time with stern expressions, while Harry merely nodded his head. Very well, he said, and I quote, everything is going into motion. You, Harry Potter, will make me become the next Merlin thanks to the wards I will place around this house. The Dursleys will hate you even more. You will become the malleable boy I need to fulfill the prophecy, the perfect weapon. And once you will sacrifice yourself to Tom, I will end him once and for all, and I will make sure the name of Potter will disappear from wizard history. With your family knowledge will be mine just like its fortune. Another long silence followed those words, but all four of them felt nothing but shock, horror, and most importantly, anger. Harry was angry because it was because of this Dumbledore that he suffered so much at the hands of his relatives. Jaya and Lana were angry because this man wanted Harry to be neglected so he could use him. The Lamia and the Jinko wanted nothing more than to find this old fart and make him wish he was never born. Esther herself wanted to him Dumbledore to give him a piece of her mind. Why? Harry asked softly, but it was loud enough to be heard by the three females who turned their heads to look at him with questioning looks. Why did this prophecy have to exist? Without it, my parents would still be alive. Maybe not, no one knows what fate has in store for us, the succubus answered with a wise but gentle tone. She is right, but you know, I'm wondering if this prophecy is still in motion, Lana muttered with a frown. Huh, the other three asked intelligently. Think about it, this Dumbledore wanted Harry to suffer but not killed, at least until he said so. And yet, His uncle toss him off a ship to drown, sure he didn't die, but he is not in his world anymore, the Lamia explained calmly. Jaya and Harry all blinked at this before thinking about what Lana said. And I think I know how our little darling here came to our world, Esther declared firmly as she looked at the boy in question. How? Jaya asked her with a curious raised brow. Look, the succubus said before waving a hand above Harry's forehead. A second later, they all could see except for Harry a strange mark on his forehead. It was not where the scar was but more to the left. The mark looked like lips. What does this mean? Lana asked the succubus with confusion. This little one was blessed by Lady Magic herself, Esther answered with a strange grin on her face. End of flashback. After that, things went a bit better even if Harry had been strangely silent for a whole hour. After being asked why, the young boy explained that after Esther healed his scar, he had received strange flashes. They looked like memories. Somehow, he now knew things he never knew existed before. The succubus explained him that he simply received this misty creature's knowledge in magic, which both amazed and startled Harry greatly. However, Esther had promised to Jaya to be back so she could teach him some magic while also helping him with his. The Jinko had been grateful for this and thanked the succubus for her kindness before Esther left to do her own business, but not being telling Jaya to be careful with the boy as there might be Momonos out there who would try to have him for themselves. Why? Both for his rather surprising magical powers and for his cute look. In fact, before leaving, the succubus told Jaya that it might be best if he received the protection from powerful Momonos. Jaya was far from a nice kitty, but even her, wouldn't win a fight against creatures such as chimeras or dragons. Thankfully, Esther accepted to become one of his protectors after Lana and Jaya almost begged her to. Once the succubus left, the remaining three Jaya, Lana and Harry returned in the inn hotel to think about what they learned so far. The young boy was still in shock about the fact his parents didn't lose their lives in a car crash like his relatives said, but, instead, were murdered by someone who apparently wanted to kill him because of a stupid prophecy. The young boy was angry at whoever made this prophecy but also at all the people who wronged him, but he was also furious about that man, this Albus Dumbledore or something. Harry was still in shock of the man's last word to him and vowed that if the old man dared to show his face, he would receive no mercy from him. He will never be anyone's puppet, he will never be anyone's little pawn. Never again will he be used against his will. For too long he had lived like this, but no more. No, it was time for him to face the world instead of hiding from it. He vowed to become the strongest man possible, and with the help of Miss Esther, Miss Jaya, and Miss Lana he will succeed. Hours later, they left the village which was named Paradise, and Harry had been sad at first at the idea of leaving Miss Lana and Miss Rosie as they were really nice to him, but Jaya promised that they will come to visit them as soon as possible, which comforted him a bit. Where were they going? To Jaya's home. As they walked, Jaya asked Harry some questions about his BRTH world, and in exchange she told him about the world he was in. Why? Because after learning of his past and the fact Harry came from another world, let's just say they were both curious. Anyway, the Jinko was both a bit amazed and disgusted by what she heard so far from the little one in her arms. While the use of technologies amazed her, how the governments worked and the way people lived disgusted her, corruption, pollution, etc. But once he finished, Jaya took over speaking of the world he landed in, and he couldn't help but listening in amazement. Apparently, this world was called Mysteria and was created many centuries ago to protect the Momonos from the cruelty and prejudice of humans. This world was created by Gaia, the mother of life, and Lady Magic, the entity who apparently sent him to this world. Harry didn't know why a goddess would do such a thing for him, but was grateful for it as now he had the possibility to experiment a far better life than the one he had on Earth. He made a mental note to thank her whenever he could. Back to present, Jaya was still walking through a rocky pass while holding Harry in her arms. At the first part of the journey, the little boy wanted to walk and the Jinko reluctantly allowed it. However, she had been impressed by how far he went on alone despite his conditions and felt proud, very proud of him. However, once they reached the other side of the woods, Harry began to feel tired and without hesitation, Jaya picked him up in her arms to carry him. He had tried to protest but lost the argument after the Jinko told him that he couldn't walk on rocky roads yet. The climbing went mostly in silence as Harry was curious about his new surroundings while Jaya would sometimes shot him furtive glances as well as keeping an eye on their surroundings. Why? To be sure that he was all right of course, but also to be sure that nothing would disturb their journey. However, at some point, the little dark-haired boy fell asleep and the Jinko was all too eager to leave him be as the poor dear was clearly exhausted and in need of rest. A few minutes later, Jaya stopped at the top of a rocky hill to not only catch a breath but also to admire the view ahead of her. "Look Harry, this is your new home," the Jinko whispered into his ears to wake him. Harry hummed sleepily as he blinked a few times before yawning cutely as he slowly turned his head to look ahead. A second later, a gasp of amazement escaped his mouth as his emerald green eyes widened in shock by what he saw. Before his very eyes, was a gorgeous valley surrounded by many mountains, and filled with appealing forests, nice rivers, and he could even see a large waterfall in the distance. But what had really caught his eyes was the large city built on the spurt of the mountain closest to them. From the look of it, it was a dark-colored five-walled fortress-like city and on each level, we could see plants or buildings and from the tiny black figures, Harry could clearly say that the place was habited. Speaking of black figures, he could see some flying in the air but because of the distance, he couldn't tell what they were. But then his emerald eyes caught something at the last level of the city. It looked like a rather large dark castle with high walls, 5 large towers and flying buttresses. Just like the city itself, the castle clearly was built with dark bricks as it was as dark in appearance than the rest of the area. Harry could, however, see the castle's courtyard and it was filled with colorful plants. Sadly, he couldn't tell what plants as it was too far for him to see at the moment. However, his little trance was broken by none other than Jaya who, upon seeing his expression, couldn't retain herself from giggling in amusement. "Do you like the view, dear?" she asked him gently and yet in a playful tone. "Yes, Miss Jaya, it's pretty," Harry said back in a really soft tone, his cheeks as red as tomatoes. "I'm glad to hear that, sweetie," the Jinko cooed at him before nuzzling the top of his head with affection. The young boy shot a soft smile to the tigerish Momono and she smiled back at him lovingly before giving him a kiss on the forehead. He giggled at the mark of affection and felt a warm feeling spreading in his body. It felt good to be kissed and hugged after years of suffering and torture. "Now how about we get a closer look, huh?" Jaya asked him with a tiny grin and a strange glint in her fiery orange eyes. "Yeah." Harry cried out in childish excitement that caused the Jinko to laugh with amusement at his response. "All right then. Time skip." Harry's big green eyes shined in amazement as he and Jaya stood in front of the large gates that marked the entrance to the city. The gates, which were made with dark wood, seemed to be around 33 feet tall while the walls looked to be around 50 feet. Then his eyes fell on the 2 guards standing in front of the large gates which were open of course. The guards were Momonos but different than the ones he saw already. They stood taller than Miss Jaya and looked pretty muscular. Both of them had fair skin but the rest was totally different. Both were appealing women but one had purple hair and the other dark blue. Harry noticed much to this shock that they had dragon-like features such as scaly arms and legs, claws on the hands and feet, fins like ears, horns on the head curved for the blue-haired one, wings and tail. The color of their scales matched the color of their hairs, purple and blue respectively. Both were wearing what looked like armors but it only covered their melons and a loincloth was hiding her nether regions. In one of their hands, they held spears. "Welcome back Lady Jaya," the blue-haired dragon girl greeted the Jinko in a respectful tone while the purple one merely bowed her head. "Hello girls, still on guard duties I see," Jaya replied to them with a tiny smirk. "Yeah, the captain caught us doing SE-, the purple-haired dragon girl began to say only to be interrupted by her comrade who hissed. "SH, there's a hatchling here." Blinking, the purple dragon girl then turned her eyes which were amethyst in color by the way toward the little one in the Jinko's arms. "Aw, he is adorable," she instantly gushed at the little boy who blushed madly in embarrassment before burying his face in Jaya's melons. "Who is he?" the blue-haired dragon girl asked the Jinko with a raised brow. His name is Harry and he is an absolute darling, Jaya answered with a warm smile as she gazed down at her charge, who blushed even more at those words, which caused the purple guard to release another coo in adoration. I can see that. Where did you find him? The blue dragon girl asked the Jinko with curiosity. It's a long story and not a good one, Jaya answered in a somber tone and narrowed eyes. The two guards blinked in shock at the sudden change of behavior and glanced at one another before looking back at them. How bad? The purple guard asked her in a serious tone. Really bad, Lila, the Jinko answered in the same tone than earlier, while Harry merely tried to look at anywhere but at the dragon girls. I see, the blue guard muttered with a sigh before a long silence followed between the four. Well, I should get going, Jaya said in an attempt to break the silence. Of course. And before we forgot, Lady Greffia was looking for you. Something about asking for a service, the blue dragon girl said with a tiny smirk. The Jinko blinked in confusion at first, but then a flash of remembrance passed through her fiery orange eyes. I see, thank you Saphira for telling me. I should get going now, the last thing I want is to make her angry. See you. Jaya retorted gently before dashing into past the dragon girls, who watched her leave with smiles on their face, with Saphira shaking her head in amusement. Harry was taken aback by the sudden action but had to admit that feeling the wind against his face felt glorious. He cheered the Jinko to go faster and she did after hearing him. However, arrived at the third level, Jaya stopped her run, which disappointed Harry greatly, but she promised him to do it again in the future. He only had to ask. After that, the two of them made their way through the streets toward the fourth level of the city, and as they walked, Harry noticed that many people, mostly Momonos, were looking at him. Like in the village of Paradise, he could hear some people cooing at him, and like before, Jaya made sure that no one tried to approach him by glaring at everyone. Was she possessive of him? Yes. Was it a bad thing? No, at least for her. Ignoring Miss Jaya's glares, the little one took the time to look at his surroundings. There were many merchants here, as he could see shops and arrays of food, fruit, vegetables, meats, fish, etc. People here looked just as happy than in the village, but there were no whole store here and instead saw a different type of Momonos. After an hour or more, the Jinko smiled as she reached one of the many buildings of the fourth level. It was also dark in color but much more grandeur looking than the ones he saw in the third level. After putting her charge down, Jaya opened the door, revealing the interior to Harry, who had to admit that it was really spacious, cozy and well decorated. Look like she isn't here, the Jinko muttered to herself with some relief. Miss Jaya. Is this your home? The little boy asked her with some amazement as he looked around. Yes and no. How come? Harry asked her while looking at her with a frown of confusion. Because you will also live here, dear. Really? The dark-haired child asked her with excitement and hope. Yes. Welcome to your new home. Harry, Jaya said to the little one with a warm smile when Harry looked up at her with those gorgeous emerald green eyes of his, shining with happiness. A few seconds later, the two embraced one another tightly, with one of them tearing up with happiness and joy. Miss Jaya. What is that building over there? Harry asked his guardian, pointing to a fairly large building with a sign reading, The House of Lust and Pleasure. Turning her head to look at what he was pointing, a mad blush soon appeared on her face as she turned tail to walk away from there, still carrying Harry in her arms. The night before, she had promised him to give him a tour of the city, and so far, the young boy was nothing but a perfect listener. They left their home at the sunrise so the area wouldn't be as crowded as it was the night before. Jaya knew that Harry was still a shy little thing and didn't want it to make the first visit uncomfortable. The Jinko decided to go through the different levels as they were pretty different from one another, and logically started with the first one. The first one was, in a way, the level of artisans and merchants. You could find items from every part of Mysteria, from the hot and arid deserts of the south to the snowy landscapes of the north, or from the forests of the west to the luxurious jungles and landscapes of the east. There were event things from the volcanic and aquatic worlds. Some of the merchants came from different parts of Mysteria, and he had been curious about some of them. He got to see a yeti, an Inari, a humanoid Momono with fluffy fox ears poking out in between long, straight blonde hair and a singular fox tail sticking along with green eyes, a Shirohebe, a type of lamia from the east, an Anubis from the desert, and so much more. The second level was in short filled with hotels and inns which welcomed travelers of all sort, were humans or momonos. The buildings were among the largest of the city. The third level was in short the part of the city Jaya was reluctant to show Harry, as it was the level where people usually go for some fun. It was the area where brothels and bars could be found in abundance. They just escaped one of them. I will tell you when you are older, but let's just say it is not a place for cuties like you, the Jinko answered to Harry as she rushed toward the fourth level of the city. The black-haired child nodded his head in acceptance of her words before opening his mouth to ask something that had been bothering him for a while. Miss Jaya? Yes, dear. I know we are not on Earth, but why is there humans here? The Jinko stopped her walk for a moment before sighing, well sweetie, there are humans here because, like you, they were sent here in the hope of a better life, or because they died in their world after, or for doing something honorable. However, only males are permitted here and they are usually older than you. Really? How come? Harry asked her with confusion while thinking about it. Now that he thought about it, he didn't remember about seeing human girls in the village of Paradise, nor did he saw some so far in this city. I'm sorry sweetie, but you are too young to comprehend the full story. However, I can tell you that us, momonos, needs human males, the Jinko answered in a calm tone after a moment of thoughts. Harry wanted to ask her, but the look in her fiery eyes told him that he must satisfy himself with her current answer. Reluctantly, he nodded his head in acceptance. Jaya sighed after saying the upset look he had on his face and gave him a gentle kiss on the forehead. I know sweetie, it's not fair, but like I said, you are too young. I understand Miss Jaya, Harry replied in a soft tone as he looked at her with a thin smile on his face. And that's why you are a good boy, the Jinko cooed as she nuzzled his cheek lovingly. Harry giggled and hugged her head. He literally hugged her head. That's the cutest thing she had ever seen. However, she managed to keep her composure as to not look like a fangirl. While Harry hugged her, Jaya smiled warmly at the child and gave him a kiss on the nose. Now dear, how about we resume our tour? The Jinko asked him with a grin. Yes. A laugh escaped Jaya's mouth at his answer, but she did start walking again while still carrying the adorable child in her arms. A child who harbored a bright smile on his face. Time skip. Honey. What do you think of the city so far? Jaya asked Harry as she prepared lunch. A few minutes ago, the two of them returned from their little tour. The black-haired child had been amazed by everything so far, and the people were kind of friendly to him. After leaving the third level, they went to visit the fourth one, the one they lived in. Apparently, the people living in this part of the city were bureaucrats, members of the guards or nobles. Sadly, they couldn't go to the fifth level as it was where the High Council resided. Curious, Harry had asked about them and was amazed to hear that this valley along with some others around were under the control of the High Council, who were consisted of the strongest momonos of Mysteria. They were the ones who made sure that no conflicts could erupt between the different regions. Harry, then, had asked his caretaker about the members themselves and was even more amazed by the answer. Apparently, each member of the councils represented a regions and its government. The North and its sovereign and Ice Queen ironically were represented by a glacis whose name was apparently Calda. The South, under the leadership of a pharaoh, was represented by an Anubis, a type of momonos who looked human but with canine features, named a Senath. The West, under the sovereignty of a dragon, was represented by a friend of hers, Graphia the Griffin. Harry was amazed to hear that part and had looked at his caretaker with admiration, which amused her greatly. The East and its sovereign were represented by the sister of its ruler, Ryu. Harry was curious about her and so asked questions to the Jinko, who answered as best as possible. Apparently Ryus were a type of dragons, but they were distinguished by having a long lower body like that of a lamia instead of scaly legs. They also didn't have wings, but that didn't stop them from being able to fly. Harry internally hoped to meet one day. Then he heard about the guards. They mostly consisted of powerful creatures such as dragons, griffins, chimeras, wyverns, worms, etc. He was amazed to hear that Jaya was formerly a guard but chose to become a trainer. But she was still friend with her former comrades in the guard, like the two dragon girls he met the day before. Awesome, he managed to respond after a full minute of searching for the perfect answer. His gorgeous emerald green eyes were shining brightly. The Jinko giggled in amusement at his response as she stopped cooking to look at him for a second. I'm glad to hear that, sweetie, Jaya retorted gently to her charge before going back to her food, with Harry watching her in silence. After they returned, the black-haired little boy had offered his caretaker to make lunch for them, and needless to say that the Jinko categorically refused by saying gently but yet sternly, "Little boys like you are too young to be cooking." However, Harry had protested, saying that he liked cooking even if it was forced on him by his previous caretakers. After several minutes of debating, Jaya reluctantly agreed to continue letting him cook as long as he always did it when she was around. But not today. Today, he will just lay down and relax while she did all the work. After all, his body was still recovering from years of abuse and starvation, and let's not forget about the lack of sleep. Noticing him looking at her, Jaya sighed deeply before slightly turning her head to glance at him. "Honey, do you like books?" she inquired him in her usual sweet and motherly tone. "Yes, Miss Jaya, books are nice," he responded with a bright smile. "Oh. Yes. I love reading. I used to hide in the library a lot when Dudley wanted to play Harry hunting," Harry answered in a somewhat bit tone at the last part. Blinking at the words and the tone, the Jinko turned her head further to look at him with narrowed eyes. "Harry hunting?" Jaya asked him curiously but with an undertone of anger. "It is a game Dudley and his friends love to play. I have to escape them, and if I get caught I was beaten," the black-haired child responded in a soft tone, to the point it became a whisper. But thanks to her tiger ears, Jaya could hear every single words. The Jinko clenched her teeth in anger as a soft growl escaped her throat. The more she heard about Harry's past, the angrier she get. However, no wanting to scare her charge, the Jinko took several deep breaths before approaching him. "You poor thing," she whispered with a coo as she picking him up before hugging him gently. Now used to this mark of affection, Harry wholeheartedly returned it with a tiny smile on his own. He had another reason for returning the embrace, as a part of him felt guilty for making her sad. Seeing this, Jaya tightened her hold a bit before giving him a loving kiss on the cheek, earning herself a giggle from the little one in her arms. "You're such a good boy," she whispered into his ears before giggling in amusement as he turned his head shyly in embarrassment, his face as red as a tomato. Putting him down, she gently used a paw to push him gently toward another room. "Go, Harry, the books are waiting for you," the Jinko told him with a playful smirk. The black-haired little boy smiled at her before nodding and rushing toward the room where the library was. Chuckling in amusement, Jaya then returned into the kitchen to finish her cooking. An hour later, the Jinko smiled as she set the table. On today's menu, pork ribs. "Harry, sweetie. Come here. Lunch is ready," she called out for the child, who upon hearing this, abandoned the book he was reading to approach her. Thanks to his small size, he couldn't reach his chair, but thankfully, Jaya helped by picking him up before setting him down on the chair. "Bon appetit, little one," Jaya said to her charge with a warm smile. "You too, Miss Jaya." Harry replied back with a smile on his own as he picked up his utensils. However, before they could dig in, something unexpected happened. Suddenly, a ringtone rang through the air, startling them both at once. Glancing at one another for a moment, Jaya then shook her head to regain her composure before slowly making her way back to the front door. Who could it be? Last time she checked, she didn't expect visits. Curious. Still sitting on his chair, Harry was curious about who it was and listened closely as he heard his caretaker opening the front door. "Gryffindor," Jaya said respectfully to the newcomer, but a gentle smile appeared on her face. "Jaya," the newcomer greeted back in a gentle but still firm tone. It reminded him of the only kind teacher he had back at Private Drive, who always looked stern but inside was nothing but a gentle woman. "I wasn't expected you, but please come in," the Jinko inquired while stepping aside to allow her friend to enter. "I know my visit was unannounced. But I needed to talk to you. Of course. If you want, we can talk over a nice meal. It would be our pleasure, thank you. Our. Hi Auntie, a young feminine tone echoed in the air along with a giggle. Hello there Gabby. How are you little one? Harry heard Jaya said to this Gabby person who answered. I'm fine Auntie. Gabrielle, the first unknown voice echoed again in a stern tone that sent shivers down Harry's spines. Sorry Mom. So the newcomers were mother and daughter. Intriguing, but the way the younger visitor called Miss Jaya Auntie surely meant that they were family. For a second, he felt out of place, but his thoughts were broken by the return of the voices. Graphia Gabby, I want to present you someone dear to me. Oh. Have you finally found a husband? Graphia's voice echoed again in a tone that betrayed her surprise and happiness. Sadly no, but I do have a boy in my life now, Jaya responded with a giggle. Can we meet him? Gabby's voice echoed again in a tone filled with excitement and curiosity. Of course, follow me, Jaya's voice echoed in response before the sound of approaching footsteps could be heard. Soon, the familiar silhouette of the Jinko appeared in the dining room, along with two others. Harry's eyes widened at the sight of the newcomers and couldn't help but staring in amazement as he studied them. The more mature of the two newcomers was taller than Miss Jaya and was really muscular in appearance as well as really pretty. Her upper body was mostly humanoid in appearance. She had long dark brown hair with white streaks, large melons and yellow eyes with red markings underneath them. Then, that's where things became interesting. Harry saw large dark brown feathery wings behind her back as her arms were covered with white feathers. Then he saw that its hands looked like eagle's talons with 4 clawed fingers. Her lower body was, without contest, everything but human. In fact, much to Harry's fascination, it looked feline-like in appearance and covered in yellowish-brown fur. Her feet looked equally cat-like and he could see a tail wagging lazily behind her. It looked strangely like a lion's tail. She wore what looked like some sort of armor but only covered her modesty. Seeing that the Momono was looking at him, Harry turned his head to look at the other stranger only to blink in shock as he found her standing right in front of him with her face inches away from his. Hi, she greeted him in a friendly tone and an eye-closed smile. She looked to be around his age and, he had to admit, was kinda cute. She looked like a carbon copy of her mother except that she had white hair and light brown wings. Along with that, she seemed to be wearing normal clothes instead of an armor. I'm Gabrielle. But I prefer to be called Gabby, the young monster girl said to our young hero with a bright smile while extending a hand forward. Nervously, Harry shot a hesitant look toward Jaya who gestured for him to go on while giving him a comforting smile. At her side, Gabby's mother looked at him with interest. Extending his own hand, the right one, he and her exchanged a brief handshake as he introduced himself shyly. Hi, I'm Harry, nice to meet you Gabrielle. I told you to call me Gabby, the young Momono childishly pouted at him as she narrowed her eyes at him. Sorry, Harry whispered softly while looking at the floor, his hands behind his back. It's okay. Wanna play with me? Gabby asked him with shining eyes. Harry mumbled in hesitation and uneasiness as he shot a glance toward Jaya who seemed amused by his shy behavior as she shot him a soft smile. At her side, Gabby's mother, Graphia, looked at him with a straight face, but by the look in her eyes, he could tell that she was studying him. Looking back at the young Momono in front of him, Harry saw the look of hope she was shooting him, and he had to admit that she looked even cuter now. I would love to, he responded in an unsure tone. Gabby seemed to have caught it and narrowed her eyes at him for some reason, and he tensed visibly in slight fear. After years of abuse and loneliness, he didn't know how to act around people of his age as he was always busy in dealing with how to survive the Dursleys. Seeing the look in his emerald eyes, the Jinko internally sighed in pity and sadness. She should have seen this coming after all, once again cursing the name of his previous caretakers. Jaya then put a smile on her face as she said those words. You will have all the time in the world to play together after lunch, come on. As she finished talking, she led everyone toward the table before she left to the kitchen to make 2 other plates for her unexpected guests. Harry, was trying his best to not look at anyone at the moment and instead, looked at his plate in silence. A part of him felt stupid for acting like this while the other part felt a bit worried. He didn't know how those strangers would react to his little behavior so far and may pretty be thinking that he was stupid. He didn't know it, but it was far from the truth. The two Momonos were looking at him, sure, but not in scorn or disgust but pity and intrigue. Graphia, the second she looked at the boy, a part of being shocked to see a male human child instantly knew that something must have happened him, something traumatic, and his entire behavior so far reinforced her thoughts. That and the fact he looked much younger than how he was. At first, she thought he was only 3 years old, but when he spoke she understood that he must have been underfed, which had disturbed his growth. She swore to ask her friend later about it and maybe get some answers. Looking at the child now, Graphia had to admit that this little one was cute. That, and he had the most appealing green eyes she had ever seen in her life. Not only that he was cute and all, but his entire behavior made him look even more adorable. What about her daughter? She was also looking at Harry with inquisitive eyes. Gabrielle could easily tell that something must have happened to him to be this shy, but herself had to admit that it made him look cute. But what had really caught her attention were his eyes. They were in short, gorgeous, and were the greenest she ever seen before and seemed to shine like pure emeralds. The second her yellow eyes locked on his, she felt a shiver passing through her body and didn't know what this meant. However, her little trance was broken by the arrival of Jaya, who carried 2 large plates of pork ribs in her paws. Drooling at the sight, Gabby thanked her auntie and waited until everyone was served before starting eating, while shooting secretive glances toward the black-haired child sitting nearby. Which was noticed by not only her mother but Jaya as well. The 2 adults shared a look and a smirk before resuming their meals. Nothing was said as they all ate in silence, but the Jinko could tell that her 2 guests and Harry had questions. She might guessed what was Harry's, what type of Momonos Graphia and Gabby were. However, she decided to wait until they all finished their plates before making her move, knowing that her charge was a bit shy in front of strangers. Harry? Do you have something to say, dear? Jaya called him out gently as she picked up the plates. The dark-haired young wizard blinked at the question as a bit of red appeared on his cheek as he saw the other 2 looking at him expectantly. Harry mumbled shyly at first before being stopped by Graphia, who said gently. Speak, child, we won't eat you. There was a hint of humor in her tone and Gabrielle giggled in amusement at this but nodded in agreement to her mom's words. A bit galvanized by those words, Harry took a deep breath, gathering all his courage, before looking back at the still patiently waiting duo of feathered Momonos. I wanted to ask, what type of monsters are you? If that's okay for you, I mean, the dark-haired child said the last part in a quick tone, filled with worry. Graphia looked at him for a second before smiling a bit as she opened her mouth to respond, only for her daughter to do it instead. We are griffins. Gabrielle, her mother hissed at her sternly. Sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for my daughter's exuberance, but indeed we are griffins, Graphia said calmly while looking at the boy whose eyes were locked on both her and her daughter with amazement. Wow, really? I heard about griffins. I read a book that said that griffins represent power and majesty as the ruler of all creatures. Harry said with pure amazement as he looked back and forth between the 2 griffins. While Gabrielle puffed her chest with pride, Graphia raised an amused eyebrow. Behind them, Jaya couldn't retain herself from snorted in amusement, rolling her eyes. Really now? Gabby's mother asked him with amusement. Griffins, Momonos or not, were all prideful creatures, so they greatly enjoyed receiving praises. Yes, after all, eagle is known as the king of birds and the lion as the king of beasts, so it makes sense, Harry said next with shyness as his index fingers touched one another. Graphia nodded her head in understanding while her daughter once again beamed at the praises, her yellow eyes shining like gold. Jaya, for her part, released a dramatic sigh as she muttered to herself. You had to tickle their ego, hadn't you? Did you say something, Jaya? Graphia asked her friend with a raised brow, having heard her muttering something. Nope, the Jinko replied with an innocent smile that caused the adult griffin to narrow her eyes at her. A minute later, the two children climbed down their chairs and were now facing the adults. Aunt Jaya. Mom. Can Harry and I go play now? Gabrielle asked her cheerfully, wrapping her arm around Harry's shoulders, leaning her head against his. The action caused him to blush madly but did nothing to pull himself out of the young griffin's grip. Jaya and Graphia shared another look, a knowing look to be precise. She might not know it yet, but young Gabrielle had already found and claimed her future husband in young Harry. But then Graphia shot her a serious look and the Jinko instantly understood the meaning. We need to talk now. Yes you can, little ones, Jaya cooed at them with a warm smile while Graphia merely nodded at her daughter in acceptance. Yeah. Follow me Harry. Gabrielle cried out in joy before rushing toward another room, pulling Harry by the hand. The poor boy barely had the time to yelp before he was carried away by the excited young griffin, leaving behind two amused adults. Once the children disappeared, Graphia turned her head to stare at Jaya with a dead serious expression on her face. Seeing this, the Jinko sighed deeply, knowing that she had a lot to answer for. Alright, what do you want to know? Jaya asked her in a soft tone and a sigh. Everything. Where did you find him? What happened to him? Why is he so thin? Graphia asked her friend with a straight face, but we could clearly see the maternal concern shining in her eyes. Sighing once again, Jaya took a deep breath before looking back at the griffin. Alright, it all started when I was walking in the forest. At the same time, Gabrielle and Harry were sitting on a couch in the library. Instead of reading books or playing, they just sat there with the young griffin looked expectantly at Harry. So. What do you want to play? She finally asked him after a moment of awkward silence. I don't know, I never played games before, the young boy admitted in a soft tone and a little shrug of his shoulders. Really? How come? Gabrielle asked him in surprise while titled her head to the side in confusion. Harry stared at her with hesitation, unsure if he should tell her or not. Seeing his internal conflict, the young griffin gently wrapped him into a hug, and thanks to the size difference she was a few inches taller, his head was at the crook of her neck. The dark-haired child blushed madly at the action but didn't try to escape as she slowly whispered into his ears. It's okay if you don't want to tell me, I'm not mad. She was a bit disappointed, yes, but not at all surprised. After all, they barely met. It was understandable that he wouldn't tell her anything, at least yet. How about I teach you how to play? She offered him with a smile after pulling herself away from him. You would do that? Harry looked at her with hope and surprise. Of course. That's what friends are for. Her answer shocked him to the core. Friends? He never had friends before. Trying his best not to cry, Harry looked back at the young griffin with a smile before nodding his head. Great. Here our first lesson, how to play guessing games. Gabrielle began to say with a bright smile, especially when she saw the stars in Harry's emerald eyes. Meanwhile, in another room, Graphia and Jaya were still discussing. But, unlike before, they were now sitting back on the chairs. And this morning I took him to a tour of the city. The rest is history, the Jinko finished with a deep sigh. The adult griffin in front of her looked angry, sad, impressed and frustrated. Why? Because Jaya had just told him about Harry's terrible past. Graphia, being a mother, was horrified by how Harry was treated by his relatives and looked ready to find his relatives to tear them apart, slowly and painfully. No wonder he is so shy and thin, the griffin growled in anger as her talons scratched the table. The Jinko merely nodded her head in agreement, not saying anything. Even if she knew the story by heart now, it still angered her. She couldn't fault her friend for being just as angry as her, as no children should suffer like Harry did. He is braver than anyone I know, and if what this annoying succubus said is accurate, his magic will be powerful. He will make a worthy husband one day, Graphia commented with a hint of respect in her tone. After all, someone who managed to survive years of abuse, starvation and sufferings must have a really strong willpower. You mean a worthy husband for a certain daughter of yours? Jaya asked her playfully. Graphia shot her a little glare but then sighed as she answered calmly, maybe from what I saw this little one's reserved and thoughtful nature perfectly balanced with Gabrielle's exuberance. Indeed they would make a lovely couple in the future, Jaya said while releasing a dreamy sigh. Maybe, Graphia answered with a straight face but there was a strange glint in her eyes as she glanced toward where the children were. But it won't be before a while now. I have a little service to ask you. At the Jinko's words, the Griffin narrowed her eyes but gestured for her friend to go on. I would love if you can become one of Harry's teachers, Jaya told her with a serious expression on her face. You will come back, right? Harry asked his caretaker with a pleading look on his face as she gently putted him down on the ground. For weeks had passed since he had met Graphia and her daughter Gabrielle, and his life turned even better. During all this times, his body was no more scrawny like it used to be, and now he looked like a healthy boy, except he was still small. What also changed was his friendship with two girls he saw as his best friends. One of them was none other than Gabrielle, the really nice albeit exuberant young Griffin, and the other was Esther's daughter, Lilith, a name that shocked him as it was close to his mother's. She was the carbon copy of Esther and was just as gorgeous as her mother, but instead of pink hair, she had dark blue one, whom she inherited from her father apparently. Harry had met her barely 2 days after meeting Gabrielle and he grew to like her. Unlike his Griffin friend, Lilith was calm, composed, but could be pretty funny when she wanted to be. The young succubus's calm nature was a polar opposite to Gabrielle's playful nature. But he loved them both equally. But unknown to him, the two young Momonos after their first meeting became rivals and tried their best to get as much of his attention as possible, which amused their parents whenever they were around. Speaking of parents, Gabrielle's mother, Graphia, has accepted to become his combat teacher, and every Friday and Monday, she would come to give him some lessons. Even if he was still too young to have the same training that guards, Graphia taught him enough to defend himself if he somehow end up in trouble. Much to Gabrielle and Lilith's happiness and pleasure, the scrawny child was slowly getting some muscles instead of bones. But his physical wasn't the only thing that changed during those 4 weeks, his magic also grew stronger. Thanks to Esther's tutelage and the memories he got from the misty creatures that lived in his scar, he could use his magic whenever he wanted, but decided to use it only when necessary or to make his friends laugh a bit. Esther and Graphia, along with Jaya, were all proud of what he accomplished so far. The first two had to admit that he was nothing but an eager student who seems to absorb knowledge like sponge. Harry was, in short, a prodigy for the two Momonos, and the young boy would beam any time he received some praises from his mentors, but particularly from Jaya, his official caretaker. Which was noticed by the 3 adults. But they also noticed that each time he would play with Gabrielle and Lilith, he would only play at one of their games and never once proposed for himself. It seemed that Harry, despite not being as nervous and terrified as before, still held some fear about being rejected by Jaya or anyone else in that matter if he didn't please her. It always saddened them to see him like this, while filling them with anger at the ones responsible for this. After a short talk, the young boy had promised to start doing things for himself instead of doing it for the others. While he was still a little shy and nervous from time to time, Harry was slowly but surely gaining enough confidence to at least make propositions during games or working for his own pleasure, even if a part of him was still trying to please both his teachers and Jaya. Apart of that, not many things had changed for Harry. Sure, he was growing stronger and more confident, but he was still the humble and well-mannered boy Jaya had met in the woods weeks ago. Something the Jinko was very grateful, as she was a bit scared to turn him into a spoiled brat, but so far it didn't happen. Back to present, Jaya was called to train some new members in the guard, and the Jinko had no choice but to go to the 5th level of the city to do her job. Of course, she couldn't take Harry with her as it could distract her from her job. Thanks to Graphia, Jaya decided to leave Harry in the building used by mothers to keep their children until their return. It was a sort of daycare. In short, all parents left their kids there, but some preferred instead to leave them to friends or relatives. It was their choices after all. The poor child had been a bit distraught at the prospect of being left alone with some strangers, but after many hours of comforting and sooth-talking, the dark-haired boy reluctantly accepted. Afterwards, Jaya made some calls as she wanted her charge to be as safe as possible. And it worked. How? You will see in a minute. Of course I will, kitten, Jaya cooed at him before kissing the top of his head in a loving manner. Promise, he asked her nervously as he held his pinky finger. Smiling tenderly at the little one, the Jinko did the same even if her finger was much bigger than his. I promise, she cooed at him gently before adding with a smile. Now be a good boy for Miss Welma. I will. Harry promised to the Jinko with a bright smile on his face. Good boy, Jaya complimented him gently while patting the top of his head with one of her large paws. The little wizard giggled at his action before hugging her leg tightly, whispering softly, "See you later, Mom." For days ago, Harry had started to call Jaya, Mom, which had greatly shocked the Jinko but had also greatly pleased her as she grew to see him as her own little kitten. While she knew she couldn't replace Harry's true mother, she will make sure that Lily's sacrifice wouldn't be in vain and will turn their little Harry into a strong, healthy, and happy man. See you later, kitten, Jaya whispered motherly to her adoptive son before giving him another kiss on the forehead. Then they pulled away from one another and after one last goodbye, the Jinko slowly left the area, waving at Harry who returned it eagerly as he watched his adoptive mom slowly disappearing out of his vision. Once his mother's form disappeared out of sight, Harry turned his head to look at the inside of the daycare and was a bit pleased to see that he wasn't the only child here. 6 girls were present and among them 2 he happily recognized. They were all more or less the same age as him if not slightly older. Gabrielle, the exuberant but gentle Griffin, and Lilith, the gentle and caring succubus. A part of these 2, were 4 girls, all different type of momonos, and he would be lying to himself if he said that he wasn't a bit curious about them. The first girl looked like a lamia but with dragon features, antler-like horns, fin-like ears, scaly clawed hands. She had long golden hair with fringes covering her forehead, gorgeous sky blue eyes peek from under them, rather mesmerizing to look at. She had fair skin and her scales were of the same color than her hair. The fur running down from the top of her lower body to the tip of her tail were also golden in color. Her slender upper body was clad by a long and whitish kimono and her tail was partly wrapped by a golden bed of some sort. Harry's eyes widened when he realized what she was, a Ryu. However, to not look rude, he shook his head to regain his composure before looking at the other 3 young momonos. The second girl looked to be pretty strong and intimidating, and to Harry, she looked like a demonic creature. Why? Because she looked like a mix between a dragon because of the wings, scaly left arm and the dragon head on her left shoulder, a snake the tail, a goat because of the white goat-like head on her right shoulder, her furry legs and her hooves, and a lion feline hair at the top of her head, furry right arm. There were also 2 pointy horns behind the ears. Then Harry saw her eyes, one was light blue and the other was light purple. From what he managed to read through Jaya's library, Harry deduced that he was looking at a chimera, a strong momono and seen as a dark beast. Unlike the other girls, she looked to be a bit older, maybe around 9 or 10 at most. Looking away, he stared at the remaining girls. The third one was covered in fur which were as dark as her skin and her eyes were burning red in color. Along with that she had canine features such as dog-like ears, clawed hands, large clawed paws instead of feet and a dark fluffy tail. Like some of the girls here, she wore nothing except bare necessities. It was a hellhound, a living hellhound. Harry was fascinated. He had read about them but had never thought that one day, he would got to meet one. Now that he stared at her, the dark-haired child had to admit that she looked more like a large puppy than how a hellhound is supposed to be. In fact, she was standing on all 4 beside his friend Lilith, who patted her head from time to time. From that simple gesture, Harry could tell that the 2 of them knew each other. Maybe they were friends. Who knows? Shaking his head, our young hero then looked at the last girl. She was without a doubt a dragon, but different from Saphira and Lila, the dragon girls he had met when Jaya first entered the city. This girl had huge wings instead of arms, mostly dark red in color except for the underside which was a dull yellow, a very long tail, scaly legs and large 3-toed clawed feet. In addition, she had dark red hair made in a short shouldered haircut, a crest of spurs on his head instead of horns and no fin-like ears. But then Harry saw her eyes and found himself mesmerized by them. she had orange-yellow eyes in color which reminded him of fire, and her slit pupils looked strangely like a keyhole. "Hello there, little one," a feminine voice echoed from his right, breaking him from his observation. Blinking, Harry turned his head to see who was talking to him. It was a dragon-like lamia with hard scales and a kind smile on her face. Curious, the young boy started to study her. She had a voluptuous body, and from her head, he could see long fin-like protrusions, her ears perhaps. Wiggling slightly in the slight breeze and adorning her head, was a crown of long, hard horns. Having seen one in a book at home, our hero recognized it as a worm. They were called earth dragons and were apparently strong enough to crush boulders by ramming into them. As he looked at her in amazement, the worm giggled in amusement as her orange eyes stared back at him. "Don't you know it is impolite to stare, little guy?" she asked him teasingly as she crossed her arms under her bust. Hearing this, Harry blushed in embarrassment and looked away from the worm, whispering softly in Parseltongue so no one could hear it. "Sorry." The snake-like dragon blinked in shock at first, but then cooed at his shyness before gently ruffling the top of his head with a hand. "It's all right, dear, I was just teasing you," she began to say in a kind tone before asking with a hint of curiosity. "Now tell me, aren't you, by any chance, Jaya's little one? You know my mommy?" Harry asked her with curiosity, all trace of shyness gone. "Of course. We trained together as guards a few years back. I missed that time," the worm answered with a deep sigh filled with nostalgia. However, it quickly disappeared as a flash of remembrance passed through her eyes. "Oh. Where are my manners? My name is Edna." "A pleasure to meet you, cutie," the worm told our young hero in a friendly tone. "I'm Harry, nice to meet you too, Miss Edna," Harry responded shyly with red cheeks. "Aw, don't be shy, dear. I won't eat you," Edna cooed at him gently. The young boy's face reddened a bit more at this, but was saved from embarrassment when he heard someone calling out his name. "Harry." The young wizard and the worm turned their heads to see Gabrielle rushing toward him with a bright smile on her face, followed by Lilith, who had a soft smile on her own face. Behind them, the other four girls were staring in silence, their curious eyes fixated on Harry, especially the Ryu and the wyvern along with the chimera's snake. "Hey Gabby." Harry greeted his friend with a soft smile before grunting when she engulfed him into a tight hug, literally lifting him up in the air. The worm looked amused as she watched the entire thing, saying nothing or doing nothing. "I'm so happy you are here," the young griffin cooed in happiness as she hugged her friend tightly with a bright smile on her cute face. "Gabby. You are going to kill him at this rate," Lilith told her with a scowl as she crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes glaring at the griffin. Gabrielle blinked at those words before looking at her human friend, who indeed looked a little blue. With a sheepish smile, the young griffin released her hold on him, letting him take deep breaths to fill his lungs with fresh air. "Sorry," Gabrielle muttered sheepishly to her human friend, who after a couple of breaths, turned his head to look at her with a soft smile. "It's okay, I'm happy to see you too," he replied softly before giving her a little hug. Harry James Potter still had troubles with marks of affection even after weeks under Jaya's care. After all, after years of abuse, it was still hard for him to not have a tiny bit of fear in physical gestures. The sound of coughing caught his attention, and he looked over Gabby's shoulders to see an annoyed Lilith who had a pout on her face. "What about me?" the young succubus whined in jealousy as she looked at him, tapping her foot to show her displeasure at being ignored. Rolling his eyes, Harry pulled himself away from Gabrielle's embrace, to which the young griffin whined in disappointment before approaching the succubus to give her a hug. "I'm happy to see you too, Lilith," he whispered softly to her in a gentle and apologetic tone. Unaware of the pouting glare the succubus was receiving from a certain griffin. Lilith, however, ignored it as instead, she shot Gabrielle a taunting smirk that caused the latter to growl in slight jealousy and anger. The worm, Edna, was looking at the scene with a smirk of his own as she understood what was going on. Those little girls didn't know it, but they claimed this young boy as their future husband. "This little one is going to be one lucky young man in the future," she thought to herself with a smirk. Back to the children, Lilith pulled herself away from her human friend's embrace with a smile on her face. "Come, Harry. "The girls want to meet you," the young succubus told the young wizard with an excited smile before gesturing to the girls in question to come closer. Harry suddenly looked unsure as he looked at the approaching girls with hesitation. Until now, he only got to meet two people of his age, Gabrielle and Lilith. Even if they had been nice to him when they first met, he didn't know if these girls would be like his friends or if they would be mean like Dudley and his gang. "Don't worry, Harry, if they tried anything, I will protect you," Gabrielle whispered into his ears as she pressed her cheek against his, making him blush at how close she was. "Thank you," he mouthed to the young griffin who smiled warmly at him before pulling her face away from his. Looking away from his friend, Harry's emerald eyes then landed on the four unknown girls who were now standing alongside Lilith, watching him. "Harry, allow me to present you some friends of ours, Cyrilla the Chimera, Raina the Ryu, Paralis the Wyvern and Hella the Hellhound. Girls, this is the boy me and the Featherbrain were talking about, Harry James Potter," Lilith said as she used a hand to point at each girl present beside her. "Hi," Harry greeted them with a wave while trying his best to hide how nervous he was. "Hello," Raina said while looking at him with curiosity as a smile adorned her face. "Yo," Paralis waved a wing in greeting, not showing any emotion on her face. Cyrilla merely nodded her head, saying nothing but her eyes were still locked on him inquisitively. The Hellhound stared at him up and down for a second before smirking toothily, "Hello, cutie." Hearing this, Harry blushed madly and turned his head away to hide his embarrassment, but sadly, all the girls saw it. In the exception of Cyrilla, some of the other girls started to coo teasingly at him, much to his embarrassment as his face turned even redder. Heck, Edna the Worm also grinned in amusement at his shyness as it made him look even cuter. "Alright girls, that's enough teasing for now. The Ryu, Raina, said to her friends after a moment with a somewhat stern expression on her face. Lilith, Gabrielle, Hella and Paralis nodded their heads in agreement even if the Griffin and the Hellhound were pouting in disappointment at having their fun ruined. The Chimera, Cyrilla, was still staring at him neutrally, not having said anything nor reacted at his embarrassed face. Then she stepped forward, which caught everyone's attention, but she ignored it as her whole attention was focused on a certain dark-haired child with emerald green eyes. Harry, however, became nervous once the girl in question stopped right in front of him with that straight face of hers. "You are interesting," Cyrilla said calmly after an awkward silence. Her tone was calm but had a strange hiss-like undertone. "You are the first male human I heard that could speak the noble tongue," the Chimera added with a frown as her mismatched eyes narrowed at him, as if scrutinizing him. "Which is something rather intriguing as only serpents or serpent-related can speak it," she said next, but her tone was different this time. Her voice now sounded more powerful and noble. He was about to ask her about it but didn't have the time as she spoke again. "Why should we care about that? I mean, yes, it's strange that he could speak the great tongue, but still. Look at him. He doesn't look much." The Chimera's voice, once again, changed and in fact sounded more arrogant and haughty. "Please don't be so mean to him." Again with the change of tone, and this time, she had a nice and comforting voice. Harry's head spun at the different tones and voices and looked sideways at his friends as if asking, "Is she always like this?" Gabrielle and Hella snickered at his face while Lilith and Raina looked at him with sympathy. Paralis, only rolled her eyes at the Chimera in annoyance before shouting loudly. "Can't you stop this, you idiot?" The Chimera blinked at the shout before looking over at them. Her mismatched eyes then landed on Harry, and seeing the lack of surprise on his face, she frowned in confusion. "Aren't you surprised by what just happened?" Cyrilla asked him in a gentle and comforting tone. "Not really. I read in a book that chimeras had multiple personalities, but I'm curious of who is who actually," he responded with sincerity. "Well, I'm the goat. It's a pleasure to meet you, by the way," the gentle voice answered him. "I'm the Snake, honored to meet you, young speaker," the calm voice with hiss-like undertone took over. "I'm the dragon. It's an honor to finally meet you, Harry James Potter," the noble and powerful voice from earlier followed suit. After those words were said, a long silence followed until Cyrilla changed personality again. She now had a sneer of annoyance on her face as she looked at Harry. "Tsk, fine. I'm the lion. Pleasure to meet you, I guess, the arrogant voice said with a shrug. It's a pleasure to meet you too, but how should I call you? Harry asked the chimera. With some curiosity and confusion. Shouting a brief glare toward the clearly amused girls around her, the chimera took a deep breath before answering. Well, we're collectively called Cyrilla, but you can refer us as Cyrilla 1 through 4. I will be the first, the dragon sighed said in her powerful but calm tone. I will be Cyrilla 2, the lion barked out with a huff. I will be Cyrilla 3 then, the goat stepped in with her gentle tone. DMN, why do I have to be the fourth? The snake hissed in annoyance and slight disappointment that caused many to giggle in amusement. Now that introductions are done, let's play. Gabrielle cried out with excitement as she raised her fists in the air. Yeah. Hella cheered in agreement to the griffin's words. Lilith and Raina glanced at one another with fond exasperation while Pyralis only grumbled something about annoying people. Cyrilla, for her part, was merely nodded in agreement but still had her eyes focused on Harry. However, the young boy didn't notice as he looked at his griffin friend with a curious expression on his face. So what are we going to play? He asked them with a titled head. Edna the one smiled tenderly as the children started bickering about what type of games they should play. Her orange eyes trailed on Harry as the young boy was playing Peacekeeper, and she had to admit that the fact he cared for everyone equally despite having only met some of them impressed her. However, the worm was also curious about the boy. While she knew he was Jaya's kitten now, she didn't know anything about his past and how could he talk the noblest of language. Shaking her head, Edna promised to have a talk with the Jinko the second she come to get her child. The following week was kinda nice for Harry James Potter as he got to know Cyrilla, Pyralis, Hella and Raina a little better. At the daycare, he had asked them many questions about either their species or what they liked to do during their days, and some of them answered him truthfully or tried to. Indeed, Pyralis was what you can call a mistrustful person as she doesn't trust easily. However, thanks to him being able to speak the noble tongue, he got some bonus points and was able to get some answers for his questions. As the time passed, the young wyvern seemed to like him, especially after he told her about a fact he read in a book. Wyverns, while inferiors to dragons in terms of strength, were the best in the air, capable of performing moves that the great dragons couldn't. But what the two species shared in common was pride. So when Harry wanted to see if what was written in books were true, Pyralis happily accepted the challenge. In the end, the young boy had clapped his hands in admiration and the young wyverns had puffed her chest in pride at the admiration shining in his emerald green eyes. What of the other three girls? Let's start with the chimera. Cyrilla was the most interesting, not only because of her personality but also because of her answer. Apparently, it was the dragon side that was in charge of keeping the other three in line, especially the lion side. After her, it was the goat who, despite being the gentlest personality, could be stern and firm when needed to be. The chimera was also the strongest physically, but when she gave Harry a hug, you will know why later, she had been gentle and kinda warm to the touch. Let's speak about Raina now. Raina, the Ryu, was the intellectual of the group and was, without a doubt, a peacekeeper thanks to her gentle and calm nature. However, she was also the most powerful Momono right now. After all, Ryus were known to be able to control weather, and that's why they were seen like deities and revered as such. She had happily, but still calmly, all of Harry's questions about her species and was glad to meet a fellow intellectual. Their loves or books and knowledge bring them together. Which didn't seem to be good in Gabrielle and Lilith's eyes if the looks of jealous the two threw around from time to time were any indications. Last but no least, Hella the Hellhound. Hella was the easiest to get along with as she was like an overgrown puppy literally. Apparently, she was Lilith's best friend and unofficial pet. The young Hellhound was in short really bold when she asked him about his size, as he was a bit smaller than the girls present. In short, she wasn't one to beat around the bush and will say things straight and simple. Which was both a quality and a default. Of course, she was sermoned by Lilith for her lack of tact, but Harry had answered that it was okay as he wasn't offended by it. Later, when he was sure he could trust them with this, he used the opportunity of them visiting to tell them about his past. Needless to say that all the girls present were pretty upset about, and they all promised to be there for him, which warmed his heart greatly. What he didn't know was that they had told their parents, who were also pretty shocked and disgusted by what they heard. Which bring us back to present. Jaya set the table which, previously, was extended by Harry to be able to gather everyone. After all, the day before, the Jinko received a call that she and her adoptive son were about to receive guests for dinner. Jaya was delighted as she could have many of her friends present at the same time. That and Harry's friends will also be present, so he won't be lonely. Who were coming? All of Harry's friends, Cyrilla, Paralis, Hella, Lilith, Gabrielle and Raina, their parents, Miss Lana, Miss Rosie and Miss Edna and her husband. Lana and Rosie were invited home by Jana as she wanted all her friends to be there. Lila and Saphira were also invited but couldn't come because of duty. When he heard that his friends were coming, Harry was delighted but became nervous when his mother told them that he will also get to meet the parents. Of course, she had comforted him, saying that everything will be okay and that he didn't need to worry. All he had to do was smiling and be cute. Which wasn't a hard mission if you are honest. However, Harry wanted to make a good first impression, so he decided to help his adoptive mom in the kitchen. The Jinko had wanted to refuse, but in the end, she conceded, especially when he gave her the cute puppy eyes. Greatly effective with those gorgeous emerald green eyes of his. That along with his cute face and his tiny frame. Anyway, it was around the end of the afternoon when our favorite duo finished cooking. While waiting for dinner to be ready, mother and son set the table, and the second they finished, the doorbell rang, alerting them that their guests, or at least some of them, had arrived. Turning her head toward the youngest people in the room, which was Harry by the way, Jaya smiled down at him as the two of them looked at one another in the eyes. Harry's eyes were literally shining at the prospect of his friends being there. "Alright Harry, can you go greet the guests please? I still have to check if the roast pig and the fish is finally done," the Jinko said to her adoptive son with some excitement. "Yes Mom." Harry cried out to his mother with a bright smile before rushing toward the front door, leaving behind an amused Jinko. Jaya smiled at her adoptive son's excitement before going straight to the kitchen. Back to our young hero, he quickly opened the front door to see who it was. Without surprise, it was none other than his combat teacher Graphia, her daughter Gabrielle, and a tall and muscular man who looked to be in his 30s with white hair, blue eyes and a short beard. He had a scar on his nose. Alongside them, Harry could see that his magic teacher Esther and her daughter Lilith were also there, along with a man who looked to be in his late 20s with blue hair and light blue eyes. He was muscular but slimmer and slightly smaller than the man that came with Graphia and Gabrielle. Behind them, were three other people. A medium-sized man, possibly of Asian ascent, with dark hair and a serious look on his face, gray eyes and very muscular. Hella the kind but bold hellhound, and what looked like an older version of his canine friend. She was gorgeous, and it was no wonder where Hella's good looks came from. "Hello. Welcome," he politely greeted the newcomers before grunting as he found himself being hugged by his best friends. "Hi Harry." Gabrielle greeted back with a bright smile before hugging him. "Yo." Hella greeted him with an eye-closed toothy smile while waving a hand. She was not a big fan of hugs. "Hey," Lilith whispered gently as she hugged him while trying to make sure to hog him all to herself. Something that Gabrielle noticed as she shot the young succubus a glare while trying to pull Harry toward her. A tug-of-war took place between the Griffin and Lilith with Harry in the center. The young boy was stunned by what was happening and was having a headache for looking at each of his friend questioningly. The parents, noticing this, shot an amused look at one another while Hella, was watching the scene with a wolfish grin of amusement. Thankfully, after a few seconds like this, a certain Griffin stepped forward to put an end to this. "Children. Behave please," Graphia sternly said to the girls, who released their hold on Harry's arms, looking down in shame. "Sorry," they both grumbled in an apologetic tone to Harry, who was slowly regaining his senses. "It's okay, no harm done," the young boy answered with a smile before he looked over at everyone, adults included. "Please enter," he politely said to them all while stepping out of the way. The dark-haired man, who was supposedly Hella's father, nodded at him gravely before walking forward, without saying anything. "Excuse my husband little one, but Haruto is mute. He cannot speak," the mature version of Hella explained to him in a gentle tone before adding. "My name's Haven little one, and it's a pleasure to meet you." "It's nice to meet you too, Miss Haven," Harry replied to the older hellhound, who smiled before she and her daughter entered the house. Harry watched them passing through him before turning his head as someone else approached him. It was the tall white-haired man who came with Gabrielle and his combat teacher. "It's a pleasure to meet you, kid. I'm Gerald, Gabrielle's father and proud husband of this gorgeous woman over there," the white-haired man answered with a smile. Graphia shot him a look and he only smirked back at her, which caused the griffin to roll her eyes in fond annoyance for some reason. "A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Gerald," Harry said to the man in a respectful tone. "Just Gerald, mister, makes me sound old," the white-haired man said back with a shiver. Gabrielle and Graphia, along with some others, shared an amused look, which was unnoticed by Gerald. Some of them looked as if they wanted to say something but decided not to. But not for long. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 3. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author Asian Lion Heart 310 on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.